Welcome to Critical Issues, Alternative Views. I'm Lyn Bartley, your host for today's show, and I'm here as we usually are with Ron Kramer, who is the head of the Criminal Justice Program at Western Michigan University, Don Cooney, who is a city commissioner and also a member of the social work department at Western. We are going to be talking about one of our four crises in this show, particularly the issue of economics, and specifically the austerity issue. And I might start out with looking at the question, what is it? What is austerity? And why do some people, some experts, particularly other economists, Paul Krugman, have felt that the policies that are being promulgated now are really the last thing that we should be doing in order to ease the economic crisis in the United States. So, what do you think? Is he right? Is he wrong?
You want to go?
No, you start.
Well, let's focus first on this campaign that's been created by Pete Peterson, who's a Wall Street mogul, billionaire, and he's created this Fix the Debt campaign, invested $60 million in it, recruited a bunch of corporate executives and others, prominent Republicans, and even some Democrats to be part of this overall campaign. Now, the true intent of Pete Peterson has always been to gut Social Security and Medicare and other essential social programs, and to cut corporate taxes and taxes for the wealthy. That's always been his true intent. He's tried in all kinds of other ways to accomplish this goal fairly successfully, but he wants even more. And so we still haven't gutted Social Security. So what he's done is to try to create a phony crisis around the debt and mobilize people to say that, you know, the debt is the greatest problem that we face, and if we don't deal with the debt, we're going to, everything is going to collapse. And so trying to use that now to accomplish the goals that he's had all along, again, to gut to the social insurance programs. So this is what we mean by austerity. Austerity means, reducing the debt, limiting public spending. And and again, this austerity idea has sort of caught on in a lot of places. It's part of overall of neoliberal economic policy or free market ideology that you've got to cut back on the role of the state, particularly with regard to its social program spending, and reduce deficits. And what that means then, of course, is cutting social programs. And the long-term effect of all this is to basically slow economic growth and create more unemployment. So, I mean, anyone who's advocating that we should reduce the debt as a way to deal with our economic problems just doesn't know what they're talking about, or they're intentionally being deceptive, like I think this particular campaign is. Because again, as Krugman points out time and time again, that austerity politics are simply bad economics. And to go down this route is going to slow economic growth considerably and throw more people out of work at a time when that should be the number one priority, right? Putting people back to work, doing something about unemployment ought to be the important issue that we're dealing with. And so if we concentrate everything on reducing the debt and slashing more government spending, then that's going to remove any kind of stimulative effect that government spending could have. And the private sector is certainly not doing it right now. They're sitting on trillions of dollars, and they're not investing. So what that means is we're going to have more economic contraction, more unemployment, and less growth.
Yeah. To me, the issue is inequality. And is austerity going to feed into the enormous inequality we have right now, or is it going to reduce it? There's no question. It's going to increase it. The austerity that has been practiced over the last few years, look how Wall Street is breaking all records. We have record numbers of people who have dropped out of the workforce. The unemployment rate now is enormous, and not only that, but the poverty rate is higher now than it was in 1973. So austerity is working for the people at the top. It's not working. And this is really, I think, an effort to just get rid of all social welfare programs. I think the fundamental question is, what's the economy for? Is the economy going to work for people, or are people going to work for the economy? And from the end of the Second World War up to 1973, we said the economy was to work for the people, that we were going to rise together. But what has happened since 1980 is the economy has taken on a life of its own, and it's all about increasing the wealth of the people at the top. And I think that's absolutely the wrong direction to go.
One commentator talked about the fix the debt propaganda campaign and said it's a Trojan horse for filthy rich tax dodging hypocrites. I think pretty well sums it up. And now I think we have to come back to the current moment now and what's been happening with the Obama administration budget proposal, because Obama is playing right into the hands of the folks that are promoting this campaign and the Republicans in Congress. He starts off the whole discussion over the debate by making an offer to basically cut Social Security benefits in the future. It's this part of this called grand bargain, right?
Right.
And so the grand bargain doesn't look so grand to me. It seems to me to be a terrible opening negotiating tactic to arrive at any kind of a bargain or any kind of a budget resolution. Basically, Obama is willing to give in on a very critical issue right at the very start of the negotiations. Now, what have the Republicans done? They're already attacking him for wanting to cut Social Security, right? And they'll use that against him, or they're saying that it's not enough to rein in entitlements, and so they're, it's just horrible. A horrible negotiating tactic. It's horrible to even contemplate that a liberal Democrat would even contemplate restricting Social Security. Now, what they're doing is they're talking about this change CPI, right, Consumer Price Index. What that means is simply it's going to limit how inflation is calculated for increasing Social Security benefits in the future. What it really means is that people in the future will get less.
Right.
That they won't get the increases that they'll need to keep up with inflation in the future. So it's a cut in Social Security. And that's just unacceptable. I mean, Social Security and Medicare, those social insurance programs are enormously popular among the American people. The Democratic Party should always be the champion of those programs and never, ever, ever contemplate one single cut to them. In fact, what they should be doing is increasing them, right?
Absolutely.
So, and if we look at what's really causing the debt or deficit problem, right, it's not Social Security, which is the strange thing. Everybody's, we got to cut entitlements. That's their fancy term. That's their term that they use to talk about Social Security and Medicare, entitlements. So they're trying to turn other Americans against it. Nobody's entitled to anything, right?
Right.
Well, of course, they're not entitlements. People have paid in over the lifetime of their work into these programs, and now they're getting back what they paid in. And so, but it has nothing to do with the debt, or very little to do with the debt. The debt is caused primarily by three things. The Bush tax cuts, the enormous tax cuts for the wealthy and for corporations. That's one of the major factors. The other factor, military spending, overall military spending, which is around $1 trillion a year right now if you take into account, as we've pointed out many times in this program, if you take into account not just the Pentagon budget, but the money in the Department of Energy for nuclear weapons and other military spending, it's about $1 trillion a year that we're spending on the military. And now that doesn't even include looking at the costs of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, right? So now we're talking, we've already spent over $1 trillion just on those wars, and the projection is that it's going to be $3 to $4 trillion before it's all said and done. So the second area that's affecting the deficit is military spending and spending for these imperial wars. The third factor is the recession, and the most important factor is the recession of 2008. At that point in 2007, the national debt was 1.2 of the GDP, gross domestic product, 1.2. Not really much to worry about. At that point, we could agree with Dick Cheney that deficits don't matter. It really isn't a major issue. We could sustain that for many, many years. However, with the recession that kicked in 2008 and all the shenanigans on Wall Street, the debt started to increase because more people were unemployed, fewer people paying into the systems. And so by 2009, the debt had risen to 11.1 of gross domestic product, okay? Which is certainly an issue, but again, Social Security doesn't contribute much to that, right? The Social Security plays a small role because, as we know, over the years, people have paid into Social Security. There was a surplus there, right? That surplus then was used to purchase Treasury bonds. Now, that's an obligation that the federal government has to pay that back into the Social Security system at some point. And actually, right now, the payroll taxes aren't enough, so they're having to at least dip into the interest off those Treasury bonds to make up for the shortfall. And so that has to come out of the general fund, because when they bought the Treasury bonds with the surplus, that was money going into the general fund. And we took a lot of money, a lot of surplus Social Security money over into the general fund in that way. So some of that's going to have to be paid back now. But right now it's a relatively small drag. It could grow larger in the future, but there's also a simple way to deal with that, right?
Yes.
Just remove the payroll cap, which is right now at $113,000. Why should people who make more than $113,000 stop paying into Social Security or Medicare at that point, right? And if we would do that one simple device of simply lifting that cap, Social Security has no problems for the long term. We don't have to dip into the Treasury bonds. There's nothing coming out of the general fund. And so Social Security in that sense has almost nothing to do with the current debt or deficit. It's all related to the Bush tax cuts, the military spending, and the recession of 2008. So again, we have to pull ourselves out of that recession. How do we do that? We need government to spend money, right? We need a bigger stimulus package. If we have government spending, we're going to start to pull out of that. We'll put people back to work. But again, the austerity politics, right? Exactly the opposite effect. So if we follow Pete Peterson and his fix the debt phony campaign, his propaganda, we're ending up hurting ourselves in the long run because we're going to worsen the effects of the recession.
Yeah, and I think there's two things, Ron, especially that out of what you were saying that really strike me. One is the deficit and the debt that we have now has nothing to, that was not caused at all by ordinary people, by ordinary working people. That was caused by political decisions that benefited the people at the top. Mm-hmm. But the response is ordinary working people have to pay for that. Mm-hmm. We didn't do it. Mm-hmm. They did it. And they benefited from all those things. They benefited from the spending on the war. They benefited from the investments of these Wall Street people. They walked away pretty unscathed from that. They benefited from the tax cut. But now the ordinary people are supposed to pick up the pieces, and that's totally unjust.
The 1% party and the 99% pay.
Yeah, mm-hmm. Right. Exactly. So what bothers me an awful lot is that the Obama administration, in the budget that they presented to Congress, has gone through the lens that the deficit is the problem. And that's exactly the wrong lens, as we've already said, that the real issue is getting people back to work. Because when we get people back to work, that deficit's going to come down. Those people will become taxpayers. We won't have to be paying them, and it's good for the country. So if that's one thing. The second thing is this. If we look at what the budget's going to be like from the point of view of Wall Street, we're going to end up with what the Republicans are saying and almost with what Obama's saying. But if we look at it through what do ordinary working people need in this society, we're going to come to a whole different set of conclusions. Of course, we need jobs. Those jobs have to pay living wages. We need to rebuild our physical infrastructure. We need to do something about our education system. We need to do something about health care, because the health care thing is going to drag down the whole economy if we don't go towards some kind of a public option in that whole thing. So if we look at it through that lens, what's good for ordinary people, we come out with a whole different budget. The conversation has to be changed. Are people to work for the economy, or is the economy to work for people? I mean, that's the basic thing.
Yeah, I think the thing I was impressed with, Kruger puts it in a sort of simplistic but quite powerful way. my spending is your income.
Oh,
Your spending is my income.
right, right.
So if we pull back at the same time, what we have is a depression. So somebody or something has to step up so that that deficit can be taken care of. And he says that somebody has to be the government. And industry and businesses are not going to pick up the pieces. They're going to argue, as I've heard people do on the news programs, that one person said, "I've never known a family to spend its way out of debt." And of course, that's quite a distorted kind of metaphor, but it is one I think that influences people. So we've got to look at it differently.
Yeah, when families spend money, that doesn't increase the revenues for the family. But when government spends money, it does.
Right.
Because it increases jobs, right? And people start to pay taxes, and it gets business booming again. And so, you know, it's a completely false analogy to use to compare the government to a family and to talk about a family budget and the government budget. They're just totally separate and unrelated items almost. So.
But the conservatives have been using this consistently.
Well, I mean, they'll use any trick in the book as part of their phony campaign. I mean, they're, you know.
Because in a family, we're not selling something to each other.
No. But even in a family, sometimes you have to go into debt.
Yes.
People go into debt to get higher education, to get training.
To buy a house.
To buy a house.
Purchase a car.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
And that we do that because we know it's going to pay off in the long run. So, I mean, the whole idea that, hey, this is the big deal, we got to do it. And besides that, it has never worked. It has never worked anyway. We really need a new paradigm. And it's really troubling that the newspaper articles and the television frame the economic issues in terms of the austerity paradigm. They don't frame it in terms of what's good for the country and what's good for the people.
Well, it's similar to the way the war was in Iraq was framed.
Exactly.
Who do? They call in the generals and the majors, and they have them come and talk about what the difficulties are and what needs to be done. They're not talking about the people who are standing against the war. So
that becomes the common sense of the country.
Right.
The conventional wisdom.
The conventional wisdom.
Right.
Yeah.
Galbraith said.
So they're good at it.
And it should be pointed out, we're not talking about socialism here. I mean, you know, you and I might want to move toward more of a democratic socialist kind of option, but that's not even what this is about. This is still working within a market economy, right? But it's saying that government has to play a particular kind of role. And the government's role is to manage both monetary and fiscal policy, to help steer the economy more generally, but you know, the means of production remain in private hands, and many of the decisions are still privately made decisions by corporations and individuals. So it's not socialism. It's what's sometimes referred to as social democracy, and we see a lot of social democratic policies had been put in place in Western Europe. We started to move down that road a little bit with the New Deal back in the 30s and with the Great Society programs in the 1960s.
Right.
But we were a latecomer to the game.
Very late.
And the kind of social democracy that developed in the United States was far inferior, far less expansive, generous, whatever term you want to use, than those found in Western Europe and other parts of the world. But even that was too much for the regressive forces, right? So in the 1970s, we get Lewis Powell, before he gets on the Supreme Court, writing a memo, right, for the Chamber of Commerce, outlining a strategy for how the regressive forces, the corporations and the wealthy, had to launch a campaign to fight back against social democracy, to restrict the expansion of government that might be benefiting working people, right? And to, again, cut taxes for corporations and the wealthy, reduce social programs. You know, and it's that campaign that's been ongoing ever since then, right? Pete Peterson's just the latest version of this campaign, right? And he's got $60 million to plunk into his propaganda to try to get everybody to go along with him. And again, now he's got the hook of the deficit, right? And, you know, you can try to scare everybody with the deficit. It's just like with the war, you know, a little scaremongering over terrorism and weapons of mass destruction, and people fall into line. And so the scaremongering here is over the deficit and the debt. The true purpose, however, is disguised, right? The true purpose is to gut Social Security and Medicare and other essential social programs, increase tax or decrease taxes for the wealthy. That's always, again, the hidden agenda, but you're using the scaremongering over the deficit as a way to try to accomplish your goals. Because if you just came out straightforward and said that was your objective, nobody would go along with it. As you said, people's priorities aren't there, right?
No.
People's priorities are different. They want jobs, and they want more education, and they want to do something about environmental issues. They want government to play a positive role in all those ways. So if you just came right out and said, I want to wipe all that out, and I want to gut all the programs that help you and make your life better because I want to more enrich myself,
Right.
it would be rejected. So you have to find another excuse, another issue to distract people and fearmonger with them.
Yeah, and I think that the two things were very effective in moving us in a direction we got now. The Powell doctrine, what he did was he got those people mobilized and pushing all together in the same direction,
Right.
and it's been very effective because they founded the Business Roundtable, the Chamber of Commerce got more active. And what did they do? They elected people. They put a lot more money into politics and elected people that were going to carry out their agenda. So that's one thing. And then the second thing is the shock doctrine. When there's a crisis and you jump in with some kind of an air, people are scared. And there was a lot of reason to be scared in the early 70s. For one thing, after the Second World War, we were the only economic game in town. Everybody else had been destroyed. So we controlled the economic system. But by the beginning of the 70s, the other countries were catching up to us. Germany caught up to us in steel. Japan was was ahead of us in electronics. And then came the oil crisis. So now there's a crisis. And their response to the crisis was, hey, we've got to reinvent business. We've got to invest more. We've got to deregulate. We've got to cut taxes. Working people have to be more moderate in their demands. Then that's been the agenda since the 1980s on. We got to get out of that paradigm. We got to get into a new paradigm that says people do deserve a living wage. People do deserve access to what they need to lead a fully human life, and that's what the economy should be for.
And I've always been sort of stunned by the idea that Powell in the so-called Powell doctrine, writing to the Chamber of Commerce, outlining the kinds of things that ought to be instituted. And then I think, if my memory serves me right, it was less than a year later he was appointed to the Supreme Court.
Right, exactly.
So knowing that issues very much related to business and corporate law and so on are going to be something he makes a decision about, how can somebody in that position suddenly shed that attitude, that sort of built-in mechanism by which they interpret benefits and deficits? How can they make a decision that's really in the benefit of the people, and not for the benefit of business?
Yeah, I totally agree with you, and we see that playing out. I mean, it's the revolving door in one way. And that's what we see right now. These people that are regulators for the government, I was just reading yesterday, the Promontory Group in Washington, which advises big corporations on how to get around the rules of the federal government. They're people led by people that were making those rules, and they're making millions and millions of dollars. And then they're also lobbying. They're lobbying because they know these people and they're there. So, I mean, if you go along with the people that got power, they're going to take good care of you. But, Camus said one time, in a world of victims and executioners, it's the responsibility of the thinking person not to be on the side of the executioners.
Right.
And Don, what you were just talking about also reveals the absolute hypocrisy of the neoliberal ideology, the free market ideology. Because, I mean, you have the Rand Pauls of the world getting up there and saying, well, you need to believe in economic freedom and we got to, limit government so we can be free. Well, who gets the most benefits from government, right? Let's look, I mean, if we look at corporate America, corporate America and the success of large transnational corporations was built on the back of the taxpayers.
Right.
It was built on the backs of government. Government played a very critical role in all kinds of ways in allowing American business to prosper, whether it was the research. I mean, think of all the government-funded research that has been translated into products and technological advances for corporations. Think about the infrastructure that has been built, whether it's the interstate highway system or any of the other parts of the infrastructure which businesses routinely take advantage of as they engage in their business practices, right?
Yeah.
That's all done at the public expense, right?
Right.
How about the legal system? Whether it's that regulatory apparatus or property law or any kind of legal, and again, Powell was in a perfect position to influence all this, right? But the laws have been designed and tilted to allow for and benefit tax law, for example.
Yeah.
The Bush tax cuts. I mean, so the legal system that comes out of the public sector also has helped to build corporations. Education, right? How many corporations depend on public education systems to provide them with well-trained and educated workers who do a good job for them, right? And to say nothing about the military, right? To say nothing about how defense spending pours billions of dollars into corporate America, to say nothing about how an active interventionist, aggressive foreign policy also has benefited corporations by getting them access to other markets and resources and just clearing away obstacles for overseas investment, right?
And protecting them overseas.
Yeah.
Protecting them and their investment. So, I mean, we really think about it, to say that, well, we don't want any government involvement, we want limited government, well, that's just a completely phony issue because they depend very heavily on government, on the state. What they want is, of course, the state to be a predatory state,
Yes.
helping them in their own predatory actions. And so as long as the state will work with them and help them in their predatory regressive practices, well, then government's fine. If government is going to respond to the people, if we're going to have a democratic government in place and the government's going to respond to the needs and demands of the people and their priorities, well, that's what has to be restricted. So now this is why austerity politics come into play. This is why the fix the debt thing is a way to limit that aspect of government and keep this aspect of government that benefits corporations going at full tilt.
Yeah.
Corporate welfare. I mean, talk about the welfare state. More money, more government money goes into corporate welfare than in any other kind of expenditure.
Unbelievable that some of these people don't pay taxes, these corporations, and we actually give them refunds, and they don't pay taxes. Refunds is the wrong word. We subsidize them.
Yeah.
And so our taxpayers, yesterday, Kevin Camps brought to campus a guy from the Union of Concerned Scientists to talk about nuclear things. And the specific one that really got me was the insurance. Nobody will build a nuclear plant unless the government insures them. That they have to buy insurance for $300 million. But everybody knows if there's an accident at the nuclear plant, $300 million won't even start it. We're talking tens of billions of dollars. So they buy insurance for $300 million, and then we, the taxpayers, insure them for the rest. And that also gives them an incentive not to put the best protection for that equipment because that costs them money. That gets them away from their bottom line. So it's actually an incentive for them not to put that stuff in there because if it goes over $300 million, they're insured for that much. The rest of it we'll take care of. So it's just one more example about how these corporations get ordinary people to subsidize them, and they flourish.
And let's use one more example because we've talked a lot about climate change and global warming on this program, and we're going to continue to do that because it's the most important issue of the day, ultimately. It's the most important moral, political, and social issue. So let's take another look now at this issue of government subsidizing industry. The fossil fuel industry gets massive government subsidies to then turn around and dump their carbon into the atmosphere and cause global warming, which leads to disastrous climate change. The International Monetary Fund, not the most radical group in the world, recently came out with a report in which they really looked at the whole issue of subsidies around the world by governments to the fossil fuel industry. They said that it runs something over $2 trillion worldwide, government subsidies to the fossil fuel industry. In the United States, it's $500 billion that goes into subsidizing the fossil fuel industry. And that's all kinds of things, from extraction and cleanup and just anything you can think about, oil depletion allowances, and there's massive subsidization of the fossil fuel industry, which makes billions of dollars in profit. It's the most profitable industry on earth. And yet this very, very profitable industry, we are subsidizing to a very heavy tune. At the same time, they're dumping their waste into the commons, right, which is our atmosphere, leading to global warming and climate change. So we're subsidizing their destruction of the environment. And again, talk about corporate welfare.
What it reminded me of is a language sometimes that is used to obfuscate what's really going on. And what you're describing, Ron, reminds me of the phrase that we need to, and this is the conservative position, we need to incentivize producers.
Right.
Now, most people would think incentivize producers. Yeah, we need to help the local farmers who are producing our tomatoes and stuff.
Yeah, right.
But what you're describing is an incentivized program for producers.
Yeah.
And they are the direct the benefits, and the public is paying the bill.
Right.
But it's a philosophy that most people aren't aware of what the complications and the end product of it is.
Yeah. I'm really concerned about poverty, and I know you are too. But did anybody see Bill Moyers on Sunday night? Because on the Moyers report, he talked about Dr. King and poverty, and he had on James Cone, the liberation theologian, black liberation theologian, and Taylor Branch, who's written the 3-volume study of the civil rights movement in the King years, America in the King years, and he's just written a new book, putting all that stuff together. But they showed a speech that King gave in April the 4th, 1967, a year before he died. And he was talking about the two Americas and the disgrace of the nation in having one nation which is beautiful, and his words were the same words that he used in the Nobel Peace acceptance, a nation where people have such a wonderful life. They have access to decent places to live, good education, everything like that. And the other one, an ugly America, where people are just strong. And I'm thinking to myself, my God, he's talking about that in 1967. He could give the same thing today. He talks about workers who are working full time but not able to support their families.
Right.
So we've gone backwards since he's given that speech, and we need to turn it around. He was warning us. This is where we'd be if we didn't turn it around. And
things are actually far worse today, because
worse.
William Julius Wilson, the great Harvard sociologist, was just here a couple of weeks ago at Western to honor our good friend Lou Walker and the Walker Institute. And Wilson's work over the years, especially his book, The Truly Disadvantaged, I think we've talked about before in this program, but what Wilson documents is that poverty today is more concentrated, more isolated in urban areas than ever before. That with deindustrialization and the loss of union jobs, the inner city had no stable job base anymore. That increasingly the middle class, first the white middle class and then the black middle class, fled out of those inner city urban areas. And then with the Reagan era, we had the withdrawal of public services and social supports, cutbacks in government programs, right? Austerity politics, right?
Exactly.
And so that's a triple whammy. And so with all those three things coming together, what's happened in the urban centers of the United States is an extreme form of concentrated and isolated poverty. So what King was describing in 1967 was bad enough, but if King were back today to look at it, he would see that it's far, far worse. That the poverty has got more extreme, the inequality has gotten more extreme, and the politics have gotten certainly much uglier because of regressive political campaigns like this Fix the Debt campaign that's going on.
I think it's interesting to see how we made progress. And it seemed to me that there were a couple of things that really helped us make progress. One was, the spirit of the times in the 60s was different, but especially because Congress held hearings on poverty. And those hearings got a lot of public attention. And they got a public response from that. And then Michael Harrington's book, The Other America, which got huge publicity around the country. That plus the civil rights movement, which put poverty very much on the national agenda. But then also the civil rights movement, a nonviolent movement, really interfered with what was going on. I mean, like Occupy did the Occupy movement did a real good job in raising public consciousness. But the sit-ins disrupted the system. The other actions that people took disrupted that system. We haven't come to that point yet where we're really actually disrupting that system. And I'm thinking it's going to take something like that to really catch the attention and make us move toward change. I know, Ron, you were talking about the book you have about how he had some solutions about how we had to move forward.
Well, yeah, let's promote this book. We haven't done that in a while. Lyn, can you want to hold it up for the camera? James Gustav Speth, America the Possible, Manifesto for a New Economy. And this book is really an excellent overall description of the 4 crises that we have identified as the issues we want to work on in this program. And the last chapter is called The New Movement. And what he argues is that progressives have to get together, that progressives are divided. The conservatives have united around an agenda that they want. It's a very regressive agenda, obviously, and it exacerbates all the problems that we're dealing with. But they, thanks to Powell's memo and the coming together of a right-wing movement and conservative think tanks, and a lot of money was invested by wealthy benefactors, and a lot of those think tanks started to generate books and articles and new ideas, and it had a huge impact on the political process. And he says the progressives, on the other hand, are divided, and we don't have the same amount of resources, and we haven't been able to unify. And he says, often we have the liberal social justice movement dealing with issues of poverty over here, and we have the environmental movement over here, and then the peace groups are over here, and those that want to reform the democracy and limit campaign funding are over here. And so, and again, he said what we need is a unified progressive movement. These factions have to come together. All these problems are interrelated. And you can't begin to talk about social justice unless you address the environmental problems, because the environmental problems are going to exacerbate the economic problems that we face. So we need a unified progressive movement, and we need a broader narrative or story about what that movement is about. And so again, I found the book to be very hopeful in that sense, but also very inspiring that yes, progressives who are working on these issues need to see ways in which they can come together and have common cause and become more of an influence in the political system. And I would just point out that the American people really are with us on that.
Yeah.
If you look at, poll after poll after poll demonstrates that the American people are really where the progressive agenda is. They're not where the regressives are. And Mattia Kramer, who works for a group called the National Priorities Project, just wrote an article that was on TomDispatch.com just the other day. People might want to look at that because she has examined the polls. And when she says, what do people want? You gave the list earlier, Don. They want more jobs. They want more education. They want to reduce the use of fossil fuels. They want higher taxes on the wealthy. They want Social Security and Medicare preserved. They want a carbon tax put on the fossil fuel industry. They want to cut the military and downsize the imperial mission. They want all of these things, and there's a large majority for these things, but that's not getting through to the political system. That's why we said one of the crises here is our political system is so dysfunctional, right?
Right.
And you were talking about the 60s, and I think back to the political system then, and you and I working at that time thought it was a broken system at that point. But look at the system today. I mean, we have shifted so much to the right. The Republican Party has become this most extreme ideological party, and the Democrats have moved sharply to the right also. So our political system, we see an extreme right-wing party, and we see a center-right party represented by Barack Obama, and then we look at what the people really want, and America's really a center-left group if we look at what the people want and the priorities that they express, but that doesn't get translated into our political system. Our politics are so distorted by the campaign financing issue and by the gerrymandering of congressional districts and by the way in which the media cooperates with the 1% in terms of framing the issues rather than framing the issues in terms of what people really want, what the 99% want. So again, that means that we have a huge problem here to deal with. And Spaeth says we can't give up on electoral politics, and often progressives tend to sort of distance themselves and give up on the whole thing. And he says we can't do that. We've got to re-engage in the political process and electoral politics while we're doing the other things as well. But again, I found the book very helpful in both in outlining presenting an outline of the new economy and talking about a sort of progressive political strategy to get there.
Yeah, and I think that the challenges are immense. But I think about when King came out really strong against the Vietnam War, and that unified in a lot of ways the civil rights movement and the anti-war movement. And Robert Kennedy picked that up. And so there, Kennedy was also talking a lot about poverty. So the two of them were bringing the whole movements together. And I think that's our challenge today, really is a challenge. And we're grappling, how do we do that? I think Occupy was a step in that direction because it brought a lot of the things together. The other thing is we can't give up on government because government's our only hope. Mm-hmm. The only hope is that we can change the rules. And that's about democracy and participating. But it's really stacked against us because of the gerrymandering, because of the money in politics. And it's not a quick struggle. It's going to take some time, but we have to start moving in the direction we're going. And I think we are, and I think people are trying to come to grips with how do we start this new movement. I'm reading a lot on that. Simple things like supporting corporations that have some kind of a conscience, that see their responsibility not just as profit, but fair trade movement, I think, is a step in that direction. The anti-sweatshop movement is a step in that direction. But it's a long struggle. It's not a quick one.
Yeah. You know, I was looking at stuff in preparation for the program, and serendipitous find here. I came across a short article by a person named Ewan Morgan on economy, and he lists the 5 prerequisites for capitalism. And what I'm going to try to say is I think we've got really here a failure of capitalism as much as anything else. Mm-hmm. The second precondition is legitimacy derived from the broad distribution of the fruits of prosperity, whether achieved through unions and collective bargaining or the redistributive function of government. So there you've got, I think, a fairly cogent description. But when that fails, coming back to your point about poverty, I think I look to Zinn. And what do we have? We have a refusal to participate in the system, which really leaves us fairly impotent. We can resist openly, hopefully in a nonviolent way, or there's rebellion. So I think when we look and to see what people are doing, they're usually involved in one of those because of the failure of the legitimacy of the capitalistic system. They're usually involved in one of those 3. And I suppose that refusal includes a form of withdrawal, which was what I see. Right. People who feel disempowered. What can I do about problem X? Nothing. So, okay, I'm not going to get involved in it, which just leads to more despair. But it seems to me that capitalism has failed in its capacity to broadly distribute the fruits of prosperity. And that's why what we're talking about, the 99 versus the 1%. It just makes sense to me.
It's a very good point. And Richard Wolff, the economist who's now teaching at the New School, well, I heard him speak recently, and he talked about the total lack of legitimacy of the capitalist system. It's not working. It just doesn't work. It has lost all legitimacy. So they really have no clothes. That's one thing. This is a long struggle, and there's a guy named Andre Gors that was writing in the 1960s in France, and he talked about something called non-reformist reforms, which means that these are reforms that have not just immediate implications, but actually work toward changing the system. And I think that's what we have to do. Any things that we can do to take power away from the corporations and give it to the people, that's a step in the right direction. Mm-hmm. Anything we can do to take resources away from the people that already have them and give them to the people, that's a non-reformist reform. And I think workers' cooperatives are a step in that direction. Getting more social services to people is a step in that direction. Better education systems in that direction. All these are steps that can lead to the real reforms that we need to do, the structural reforms.
Well, if you take education, the movement, I think, that's going on in education right now is to privatize as much of it as can be. Now, my understanding is that not much of that privatization is done by nonprofit organizations. It's done by people who want to make a profit. So then one has to examine what's the outcome of education when you have people who want to make a profit running the organization. What happens to democratic process? What happens to academic freedom? What happens to research? If those things don't produce in a capitalistic way, then they're going to be set aside.
Yeah.
So it is a frightening prospect.
To say nothing of the teaching of critical thinking skills.
Right, that's off the agenda.
Which is absolutely right at the top.
Right. The whole idea of education is becoming training grounds for the corporations. It's not about critical thinking. That's why we have to keep pushing that and make it that way.
And again, when William Julius Wilson was here, he talked about, from a sociological perspective, sociologists talk about structural issues. You just talked about some of the structural factors. So how do political and economic institutions work, and some of the bigger, tougher things that we're up against in terms of bringing about change. But he also pointed out that while structure is always the most important element to be analyzed and dealt with, that culture is important as well, because the structural forces operate through then values and ideologies and social meanings and definitions that people develop. And often those cultural issues become the most important thing, because they tend to block any effort at dealing with the structural changes, right? So, I mean, if we just look at the climate change movement, we know that, again, it's the capitalist system and the fossil fuel industry and the burning of those fossil fuels and the carbon dioxide going up in the atmosphere, and we've got to do something about that. But what happens? There's a culture of denial, right?
Yes.
That's actively supported by the fossil fuel industry and funded by the fossil fuel industry, but it's also just part of cultural commitments to a particular idea about how the economy should work, right? This free market ideology. So you have this culture of denial, and because of that culture of denial, it tends to block any kind of political action. And I think we could find that on just about any issue that we talk about, that there are certain cultural factors that need to be taken into account. And that's why this program and teach-ins and social movement organizations need to constantly be engaged in this process of helping to educate people and show them, give them some of the critical thinking tools and provide them with some of the analysis that's going to allow them to see how these structural factors really do affect their lives. So the combination, culture and structure, always have to be taken into account together, I think, as Wilson pointed out.
He did a really good job on that, yeah, and his latest, what what was his latest book?
More Than Just Race.
More Than Just Race. He talks about that a lot, about the cultures of the inner city and how that disadvantages young people that are going for jobs. Because in order to survive in the inner city, you have to buy into that culture. But that is not at all helpful when you go out and try to get a job in the other areas. I think that's, I'm sure it's all our experience, how excited students become when we begin to help them see different analyses and have them think about different ways to approach issues. And because they haven't been exposed to that very much before, but they love doing it, and it's really exciting.
Yeah, I just was looking at some documents from the Mississippi Summer Teaching Project. And one of the things that struck me so strongly, and I don't want to digress too much into the education because I want to come back to this other, but how integrated that educational process was for the people who participated in it. Not only the teachers, but the students. Questions were asked, for instance, students were asked to look at certain conditions in the state. And then they were asked, well, how does that affect you? Then they were asked, who produced those documents that had the effect on you? And when did they occur? And then what's the strategy? Since you now know what the process is, what's the strategy that we're going to promulgate in order to try to work against it? And it just seems to me that's what you mentioned the critical thinking at the very important point there. That's exactly what critical thinking involves. And that's what we want, I'm sure, education to produce.
That's right, and that's a Palo-Freire.
We are products of it.
Absolutely, we are. And that's the Palo-Freire approach, that education should be about, he started with literacy, but it should also be about political education and raising people's political, not in the terms of electoral, but in terms of power. And how did things end up this way, and what can we do about it, and what is our abilities to change these kinds of things? I mean, I think people have to really look at that.
Right.
It's very difficult now, though, because I think that students live in a very different world than when we started teaching. It's much more expensive to go to school. The jobs are not there, so they're really scared about going to school and ending up not getting a job. And also their time is more limited because all of them have to work now and put in a lot of hours that doesn't give them the time to do the reading and the investigation that they need to get. So I think it's much harder for students now to get into the critical thinking than it was before.
They're preoccupied with other things.
Yeah.
Their smartphones, for one thing.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
No, and I did think so. We do need to take a look at social media and the emerging technologies, the smartphones and tablets and all of that, and the various forms of social media that really do eat up a lot of the students' time. They're so consumed by that. And it's a format that doesn't lend itself well to critical thinking. Going back to the idea that we had moved away from being a typographic society to a screen society, television society, that whole notion. And I think it's only become worse with the emergence of these new forms of social media. So I think we have even a more difficult struggle, I think, in trying to teach the ability to engage in critical thinking given the other kind of distractions and limitations and what the students are dealing with.
Very much so. Yeah, I think that's true. Chomsky talks about that a lot in his most recent book, where he's interviewed by Barsamian. He talks about power. And he talks about how, you can't outline if you're reading something online, and you can't put notes next to it, and that's pieces of critical thinking, and you can't do that in electronic stuff.
Well, what's the division between the political aspects of this now and the economic aspects of it? I mean, how can we've looked at both now. Where do we go from here?
The rules have to change.
Okay.
And it's the political system that will change the rules. And the political system, the elected officials won't change the rules unless we mobilize enough people to make them do that. So I think our immediate challenge is to get more and more people involved in the struggle.
Some would say, I love it when the public television people use that. I have often wondered down about whether we can succeed at that, whether the power of the people really can overcome the power of money. What's your thinking?
I think it's our only chance. I think it's either that or violent revolution, which is a loser. And I think the whole promise of democracy is that people have the ability to rule themselves and that they can rule. And this is what we profess as a nation, that liberty and justice for all, and all people have inalienable rights to life and liberty and the pursuit of happiness, and we have the right to take that, and I think that's the only chance we got, is to mobilize people.
If you look at history, Howard Zinn always made this point, that you can look at different examples in history where organized social movements have actually produced important social changes. And so Zinn's hope was always that, again, those kinds of social movements could be created once again and work in the same kind of way to bring about the necessary changes. That was his hope always. And that's what Speth is talking about in this book, that we need that kind of organized social movement. We need the progressives to get together to create that more powerful social movement to bring about these changes in the different areas. But that's the way things change, and it won't change unless that kind of more powerful social movement is able to be created.
Well, I'm sorry, Don, go ahead.
Well, I would just say that there's a lot of hope on that. I mean, the people that gathered in Washington on immigration reform this past week. Lyn, you've been going to these meetings at Tuesday night about people in the Edison neighborhood and people from around the community trying to get that poison out of the Edison neighborhood. The first meeting we had, on about 3 days' notice, we had 100 people. Last week we had 130 people, and we're going to get more. So I think people are coming together. It's just a tough struggle.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it seems to me that, at least for me, the two of you represent the ways in which that can be done. You've worked at it for years. Your work in the last 10 years with KNOW has led to results both locally and I think on a national level. Connections have been made. Your work in poverty and social justice of other kinds. So there is hope. I mean, and it does happen on a local level in a way that I think spreads. And what we need is more people
who are out there
joining us in that effort.
And your work with the unions, especially the
yeah.
work that was huge, Lyn.
Well, and we got to. It looks like we may have to start pretty much all over again. But well, what a great discussion this time, delightful, and I look forward to our next time getting together. And I hope that you will join us on our next issue of Critical Issues, Alternative Views. And we'll see you then.